I'm here with Dr. Corey Wilks. Corey, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Likewise.
So, just to start off, can you tell us a bit about your background? How did you get into the field of psychology? You were trained as a clinical psychologist and now you're a coach, but give us a sense of what that journey was like to where you are now.
I actually hated psychology when I was a kid. Um, l- Long story short, I needed therapy as a kid, and a lot of the therapists I went through a lot because I was a shitty kid, and a lot of the therapists that I went to were like the stereotype of therapists, like, oh, how does that make you feel? Lay down on the couch when I have my clipboard, and it didn't resonate with me. And then in high school, I took a psychology class, and the instructor didn't really know what they were talking about. So I was like, oh, psychology's stupid. Took an intro psychology class in college, taught by a GA who was just kind of getting through it. I slept through classes because I was like, this is stupid. Like psychology's bullshit, pretty much. And then because I think I was like either like a dietetics, which is like food nutrition, or like a business management major, but I had a required like human development course. And it was just a psychology class. And it was like, with Dr. Keelan Hinton or with Dr. Hinton, I was like, all right, some old ass white dude who, is so ancient when he talks or moves, like chalk just kind of comes out of his armpits or something, is going to come teach this class. Okay, fine. I have to take it. And and it was a class of like 100 people. And in walked this like young, tatted up black dude from Memphis. And he was like, hey, I'm Dr. Hinton. And I was like, you have my attention. Because like he didn't look like, the stereotype of an academic professor. He didn't talk like one, like he talked like he was from Memphis, covered in tattoos. Like he looked like a real dude. And um, and he did a lot around like race and culture and things. So that was a huge part of how he approached his lectures. And the passion that he had for psychology and the way that he explained it, as far as like, you know, basically people are like puzzles. And part of psychology allows you to help people put those puzzle pieces in place so that life makes more sense to them, the world makes more sense, so they can understand themselves and their environment better. And just the way that he approached psychology and just who he was really resonated with me. And like that day, I went to the bursar or whoever and like changed my major to psychology because of him. And so got a bachelor's, got a master's, got a doctorate. And that was all primarily for like to do therapy, right? So I did a lot with like depression, anxiety. Then I started working in what's called integrated primary care. It just means if you go to see your regular doctor, like your physician, and you have anxiety, addiction, ADHD, something like that, an eating disorder, whatever, they would say, hey, you need to talk to Corey. So they would pull me in. So you're already at the doctor's office, and then I would just come in and talk to you. This is really approachable for people. And I did that for a while. I did a lot with addiction treatment specifically. So helping people, overcome like heroin or meth addiction or alcohol, things like that, other substance use disorders. And how I got into coaching is in 2020. So like, pandemic, um, I moved and I negotiated a remote telehealth position with my old employer. Um, so I'm licensed in the state of West Virginia, but I moved to Kentucky. So everything was working really well because again, peak COVID, so everybody's isolated, things like that. And about 2 months into my new contract, I got an email, and my employer, they're like, "Hey, we are going to pull everybody back into the clinics, and because you are fully remote, you're fired." They're like, "You're great. Patients love you. Your coworkers love you. All your paperwork is good. Like by every metric, you're a model employee." Which ironically is probably the only time in my life I was a model employee. They're like, "But you're fired. You have 30 days to figure out your life." So the issue with therapy, if, for people who don't know, at least in the US, is I can be anywhere in the world and do a remote session with you. But you, as my patient, have to physically be in the state I'm licensed in during that call. You don't have to be a resident of that state. You just have to have your 2 feet on that piece of dirt. I was licensed in West Virginia, living in Kentucky. I couldn't find another remote job out of West Virginia. I wasn't willing to move back because we had just gotten a house, in Kentucky. And in order for me to get licensed in Kentucky would have taken 4 to 6 months just because of how licensure boards work. Like the board only meets, once every other month, and they only see 2 or 3 people, and they were already booked out 2 meetings in the future. And so I was like, well, I can't wait 6 months to make money. Like I wasn't prepared to be fired. Um, so I effectively couldn't do what I had spent the last 12 years of my life learning to do. Like I literally could not practice therapy. And I had spent over a decade of my adult life learning to do therapy. So I had an identity crisis. Um, and all through school, we, I mean, psychologists, like we were kind of elitist in certain areas, for better or worse. And I remember in college, we would just straight talk shit about life coaches. Because, like, to be a life coach, to be a coach, there's no qualifications, right? Like, you don't have to get a license, you don't have to have a degree or a credential. Any 14-year-old with a TikTok can put hashtag life coach and nobody can do anything about
Exactly.
it. So I was kind of burnt out on therapy anyway, because there, as you know, there are a lot of there's a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of jumping through insurance hoops and dealing with, old institutions that don't want to change. And it's really hard because with therapy, you're only allowed to help somebody barely get their head above water, because as soon as they become what's called subclinical, a lot of insurance companies will drop them, which means you may still be a little depressed, but you no longer warrant the diagnosis of major depressive disorder, single episode mild. And because of that, insurance isn't going to cover you. So if you can't afford it out of pocket, you have to stop going to therapy. I was really burnt out on how sort of hamstrung I was to help people. So it's actually a good thing I got fired because it forced me out of that nest.
Mm.
Um, but I had all this internalized stigma around being a coach. So one day I was reading an article in by the American Psychological Association, and it was basically saying, look, coaching is an unregulated field. It is the Wild West right now. But that could actually be a good thing because people like psychologists or other mental health professionals can join this field to improve the quality of it. I was like, oh, that's a really interesting take. One of the guys who was quoted in it, his name is Dr. Jeffrey Auerbach, and he runs the College of Executive Coaching. I was like, oh, let me check that out. And it was sort of like a by psychologist for psychologists sort of coaching program. So I ended up taking it, and it was really good. The main reason I took it, other than like liability, was to help me make the mental shift from the pathology model of therapy, where you basically see everybody as sick and you try to help them just be not sick, into a wellness model. Because the thing I realized with the therapy world and a lot of the medical field in general is, in therapy, we define wellness as the absence of illness. But just because you're not sick doesn't mean you're healthy, which I never realized that was what it was. We were never really allowed to help people thrive or flourish or optimize. We were only allowed to help them just tread water.
Mm.
But with coaching, I was able to take people who already function pretty well and help them really get more out of life. Like I said, to flourish, to thrive, optimize, self-actualization, whatever term you want to put on it. That is more so what therapy is about, or coaching is about. Therapy is about bringing somebody from dysfunction to functioning. Coaching largely is about bringing somebody from functioning to flourishing a lot of times. So that's sort of my journey so far to where I'm at today.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. I'm curious kind of how you're finding this work. And you mentioned being burnt out from doing therapy with people. And I know that I can, relate to that on a very deep level, but how has this been different for you being in the coaching realm? And are you finding it rewarding, focusing more on kind of flourishing and those aspects of of our life?
I absolutely love coaching. Um, and that isn't to say I didn't enjoy therapy, because fundamentally I enjoy helping people get more out of life and just live a better life, whatever that looks like, right? It's just the issue is, and we talked about burnout. One of the things that I had heard, another way to think about burnout is moral injury, right? So it isn't that you're just work too hard; it's you feel helpless to really make a difference, or you feel that the work you're required to do doesn't resonate with your own moral compass, right? And that was my issue with a lot of therapy is I know I can help these people more, but I'm literally not allowed to. I'm not allowed to see them because they can't, their insurance won't cover it, or I'm not allowed to see them because of whatever reason, or I'm not allowed to see them because they're not in West Virginia right now, right? With coaching, I have clients in the UK, in Las Vegas, in California, in New Zealand, right? Because that restriction isn't there with coaching. Um, there's just there's a lot of other things with just how the therapy world works, right? But um, with coaching, the people I work with are very driven and very engaged, right? So there's it's also just the things that you're working with people on are just very different, right? So coaching for me, I primarily work with like entrepreneurs. So we don't deal with anxiety or depression or addiction, right? Because those are all in the realm of therapy. They're not for coaching. But things that we do work on are like, how can you remove yourself as a bottleneck so that your company can scale? Or how can we approach your perfectionism, because your perfectionism is actually becoming more of a liability at this point, because it's keeping you from having more of a growth mindset. You're waiting for something to feel perfect before you actually hit publish or launch your product or whatever. How can we rethink this so you have more of an iterative approach of, well, let me just get out a rough version of this, like a V1 or an MVP, a minimum viable product, and then iterate from there, right? How can we just mentally approach this a little more strategically so you can actually make progress, right?
Mhm.
Those are more along the lines of things that I work on. It's still like in the realm of like, mindset, psychology, like mental game type stuff. But what we're focusing on tends to be very different.
Mhm.
So I get a ton of energy, and just, I mean, man, I get to work with some of the most inspirational people in the world. Um, and I'm allowed to talk about them because they're coaching clients, right? Like with therapy, you could work with a celebrity, you're never allowed to tell anybody. Right. With coaching, and even if that person says like, hey, they're my therapist, all the most you can do is be like, I mean, that's what they said.
Right.
But with coaching, like I'm allowed, again, like I always get consent, but like I'm allowed to be like, I work with this person. This is what we've done because they have said I'm allowed to talk about that, and we can collaborate publicly on things. You can't do that with therapy.
Mhm. Mhm. You mentioned perfectionism, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you refer to as the four horsemen of fear, the things that get in the way of us either achieving or just pursuing things that are meaningful and valuable to us in our life. What are those four things?
Yeah. So the four horsemen of fear are the four most common limiting beliefs that I see stand in our way, whether it's entrepreneurs, content creators, anybody trying to do more meaningful, purpose-driven work. These limiting beliefs, these horsemen tend to pop up. So the first one is one everybody's familiar with, which is fear of failure, right? And that horseman says, what if I'm not good enough? What if I fail? What if I can't make this work? Everybody has experienced fear of failure. The second one is fear of ridicule. And this is one where, well, what will my friends and family think? How will other people react? I hear that especially with people who want to become content creators, who want to write or put out YouTube videos, or musicians, artists, things like that. There's this huge fear of ridicule, of criticism and judgment. So a lot of times that prevents us from doing more meaningful work because we're more afraid of what these quote unquote other people, whoever that is, might say or how they might react, that we ignore ourselves and the value that we have to give to the world. The third one is fear of uncertainty, right? And this is where it's like, well, I don't know which path is right for me. I don't know which decision to make. I don't know which idea is worth pursuing. I don't know which job to take, whatever. And this fear of uncertainty paralyzes us in place because we're so afraid of making the wrong decision, we end up making none, right? So think about anytime you've some of the most common things I see is like, well, I want to start writing. Well, then which writing software should I use? Should I use Grammarly or Hemingway or Scrivener, or should I use this editor? Or, Corey, I want to, create a website. Well, what hex code for the color should I use? What font should I? What about, like, should I use Squarespace or Wix or Ghost or WordPress? Like all these things that honestly, especially when you're starting out, don't matter. But people try to make it perfect before they even begin. And then you're, going down 12-hour YouTube rabbit holes trying to find the perfect thing. And all you're doing is actually accomplishing nothing, right? And the fourth one is fear of success. And this one's weird because it's like, well, Corey, why would I be afraid to claim the thing, or to achieve the thing I claim to want? Like, I say I want to be successful. You're telling me I'm afraid to be successful. And the thing with success, if you've never achieved major success, whatever that means to you, success represents like this before and after version of ourselves. So if you've never achieved success, the only version of you that you know is pre-success. So achieving success represents crossing this threshold and potentially becoming a different person. Well, we fear the unknown. So, like, well, I don't know that version of me. Like, that guy could be an asshole, right? Like, what if I lose my ambition?
Mm,
What if I become corrupted by power and influence?
mm,
Right? What if that means I've peaked in life? Like, I don't want to peak when I'm in my 20s or my 30s. Like, if I achieve major success, like, that means the rest of my life is, downhill. And other people deeply believe that they don't deserve success, right? So when we have these fears, these limiting beliefs, they tend to hold us back, or they tend to cause self-sabotaging behaviors that keep us from facing the thing that we're afraid of, right? So like perfectionism could be a way for you to avoid this fear of ridicule or this fear of uncertainty potentially, right? Of like, well, until I feel that this thing is perfect, I'm never going to hit publish, or I'm never going to launch, or I'm never going to make it publicly available. Because the longer I tinker, the longer I just make these little improvements and I keep it in this idea lab, the longer I can avoid it potentially being out into, going out in the world and it not going right. Right. So it isn't that your perfectionism means you have a high bar for quality, right? Everybody has a high bar for quality. Everybody wants to put out the best thing that they can and be the best version of themselves that they can be. That isn't perfectionism. Perfectionism, because think about it this way: perfection is unattainable, full stop, right? Like nothing is perfect. So by definition, perfectionism means expecting yourself to attain the unattainable. That's why people are constantly restless and feel dissatisfied when it comes to perfectionism, is you're saying, when it is perfect, then I will move forward.
mm,
Perfectionism isn't your problem. You're afraid of something. You're afraid of judgment. You're afraid of failure. You're afraid of making the wrong decision, something. That is the root issue, not the perfectionism. The perfectionism is just helping you avoid something deeper that you're afraid of,
mm,
typically.
mhm. Thank you for explaining those so clearly. And all four of these things help us maintain the status quo of where we're at versus where we want to be. And so I'm wondering how you work with people to start to approach some of these fears. And in the clinical realm, we might refer to, something like exposure therapy, like exposing ourselves to the thing that we're afraid of. But is that similar to how you might work with someone in dealing with these four fears: exposure to the possibility of failure, exposing themselves to not being perfect? Is it a similar kind of process?
Similar-ish. I call it fear inoculation. And, obviously I'm not that kind of doctor, but my understanding of how vaccines work or inoculations work is they introduce a little bit of the bad thing in a controlled environment so that your system can build up a tolerance or an immunity to it. So in case you ever run across the real bad thing, you can better handle it. Okay. That is my very clunky way of explaining how vaccines work.
Works for me. Sounds right.
So fear inoculation is, let's do a thought experiment and say, let's catastrophize for a second. What is the worst case scenario that you're afraid of? Right. So let's say if fear of failure, like that horseman, is holding you back. Okay. Let's assume you fail. Shit hits the fan. What specifically does failure look like? What specifically contributed to your failure? Let's write it all out. Let's make it as concrete and real as possible. So now that we've assumed the worst case happens, with that assumption in place, what happens next? How will you recover? Right? What do you do after this catastrophic failure? Right? Do you go back to the drawing board? Do you look back and say, okay, what can I learn from this? What specifically contributed to your failure that you could apply to the next thing? So maybe you were a control freak, and that was why, like, you became the bottleneck with entrepreneurs. Like, you became the bottleneck for your company. Okay, well, if that was what contributed to your failure, what can you do different? Can you delegate more? How much can you outsource? Can you build a team and empower them to where you don't have to do everything? How can you basically like reconstruct your own narratives around what it means to be a boss or to be a leader, so that you don't feel that it is your responsibility to do every single thing? Like, maybe you need to learn to give yourself permission to offload some of that and learn to trust your team to do some of that work. Because once you do that, and maybe that's your takeaway, like, oh, I need to delegate more. Since I delegated more, I wasn't the control freak. I wasn't the bottleneck. So my business didn't fail. Right. So that was what you learned, and you can take to the next thing. So that's sort of how fear inoculation works. Of, imagine the worst case happens. With that assumption, what is your plan? How specifically are you going to recover from it? Because once you do that, you feel prepared to deal with it if it happens. Well, now all of a sudden, failure isn't nearly as scary, because one, now you know how to avoid it. But two, even if it did happen, you could recover from it. Because, like, fundamentally, we fear the unknown. So
Mhm.
by making the unknown known, or at least knowable, we rob these horsemen of their power over us.
You were mentioning before your own experience and kind of making this leap from being in the world of clinical psychology to coaching, and kind of how that happened really quickly. And one of the catalyzing forces was burnout. I imagine that you work with people all the time. I imagine that a lot of people listening are experiencing some sort of burnout, or they're just recognizing that I'm not doing some work that's meaningful, that's passionate to me. I want to make this leap. Um, can you kind of give us a sense of how you work with someone like that? And maybe an example comes up of a recent case, but how do you start with someone who really wants to make that transition? Um, One of the questions I have is, do you encourage people really to make that leap, or to kind of really slowly and methodically start to plan what that transition is going to look like, and take kind of baby steps in that direction? And is that what have you found has been most useful?
Okay. So I'll preface with, I usually work with people who are a little bit further along in that, on that track, as far as they have a track record for success in some way, right? So, like, I'm not a career coach, right? Like, career coaches are more like, I'm at this crossroads. I don't know which job to take, or I don't know how to become an entrepreneur, for example. That isn't the niche that I am in. However, um, there are a couple ways of thinking about it, because even like some of the entrepreneurs I work with, like, some of them are like, hey, I'm really good at building, these businesses over here, but I want to become a writer, or I want to start creating content on this thing that is not in any way related to my other companies or my other businesses or whatever.
Mm.
So there's similarities. A couple things. If you are coming at it from like a regular 9 to 5 type situation, I don't recommend my path, right? I was shoved out of the nest, right? And though I am forever grateful that I got fired, the way it happened was very disrespectful, and I was not financially prepared for that leap. Now that lit a fire under my ass, like, because I was like, well, I have to make this shit work, right? Like, I don't have mommy and daddy's money. I don't have, 10 months of runway in a savings account. Like, I just got to figure this shit out now. Highly stressful. Do not recommend. Okay. It works for some people. You just, cut the cord and just go. And, the metaphor is like build the plane in the air. That works, but I don't really recommend it. A very simple, low stakes way. Daniel Vassallo, he is a guy, he talks about small bets and making small bets. And the whole concept of small bets is, can you create like one project or I hate the term, but side hustle a month, right? Can you just do 12 experiments a year? One, like every month is like themed, right? And I'm probably butchering how Daniel describes his small bets thing, but you should check out Daniel Vassallo, small bets. But if instead of saying, well, what is something I want to dedicate my life to, or for the next decade, that's really hard to wrap your mind around, especially if you're kind of flying solo, if you don't have like a coach or somebody to really help you, like walk you through all that. A much more approachable way is, for the next year, every month is going to be a theme. So maybe the first theme is, I try out this thing that I've really been interested in. Maybe I spin up a website and I put out 5 articles, or maybe I start a YouTube channel and I put out 3 videos, right? Or maybe I talk about woodworking, or, some very like a hobby or something. Or maybe I want to develop this really, really simple app, and I want to see what happens, right? You can try out these very, very low risk things, and just every month, like for that whole month, that is the thing, because that helps you stay focused. And the goal of it is, by the end of that month, for that thing to be complete. But I'm like, I developed a digital product this month, so now that digital product can go out and be working for me, right? Or I want to start doing speaking engagements. Okay, well, for this month, everything, all of my non-work time is going to be, that is available, is going to be dedicated to positioning myself to speak. I'm going to do a lot of outreach. I'm going to record myself and put up a couple promo videos of like, hey, here are the things I speak on, right? And just do that. That is a way for you to experiment relatively rapidly, and then see which one of those do you enjoy more, which one of those may be gaining traction, and then kind of taking that back and looking at the data of like, oh, I really enjoyed that month, or I really, really enjoyed this. I want to keep going. That is a really low stakes way of starting to experiment, to see what you find more meaningful, more purpose driven. There are a lot of other frameworks, but without me knowing like a specific person, a specific situation, that is probably the lowest hanging fruit of how to start experimenting, to then see the next kind of stage of your life if you want to go that direction.
Sure. I imagine with that approach, a lot of people might experience kind of a analysis paralysis, or they might enjoy a lot of different things. And I'm curious what you might recommend to someone like that who's enjoys multiple things. Maybe they enjoyed 5 of those things and they love all of them, but they're afraid of making a choice because they don't want to say goodbye to the other 4. So what would you say in that situation?
Well, one, you don't have to, like, not everything has to be financially viable, right? Like, some things can just be a hobby, or can just be something you do because you enjoy it. So that's one. Sometimes, let's say you have 3 things. Maybe there is a way for you to combine them and create what Nicholas Cole calls a category of one, right? So what is something, or David Perel calls it a personal monopoly. So what is, like, if you think about like a Venn diagram. So like, I really like this, I'm really good at this, and this seems to be, a lot of other people tend to like this, right? So I'll use myself as an example. And I'm not claiming to be a category king on this, or a category of one on this, but it's an example. So I'm a psychologist. I really, really like talking about psychology. I also really enjoy the Stoic concept of Memento Mori, of using mortality as a motivator to live fully. And then I talk a lot about flourishing, fulfillment, self-actualization, these types of things. Well, there is this space in between where they all overlap, right? Of like, I can use my experience as a psychologist and just what I know about psychology, and I can incorporate how you can use mortality as a motivator to live fully so that you can flourish. Well, how do you flourish? Well, you apply these concepts from psychology. Why should you do that? Well, because you're going to fucking die one day and you need to make the most of the time you have left, right? And just it goes around and around. That is a way for me to combine these three things. Like, well, I really like psychology. I like, optimization or productivity, and I really like stoicism. Well, these seem like very separate things. Well, there's potentially a way for you to combine them. And now you have something that it's really hard for you to have competition over, because nobody, potentially nobody's competing in that very specific space. And that allows you to kind of develop a reputation if you're going to do this for financial gain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because like another thing, like with me, right? Like one of the reasons a lot of people reach out to me about coaching or to do like a training or a workshop or something is a combination of they've seen me do like a podcast from somebody else, or they've read something that I've written. But the other thing I hear a lot is, well, I want to work with you because you're a psychologist, but you're covered in tattoos and you cuss a lot. And like one of the guys, one of my coaching clients, he's like, look, man, Nassim Taleb has this quote that basically goes, anytime you have to pick between two doctors, pick the one who doesn't look like a doctor. That is something that works really well for me personally. But at the same time, all through grad school, everybody was like, no, 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 cover your tattoos. Don't cuss like that. Wear khakis and a polo. Like that, like the thing that everybody used to tell me to hide, I decided to show, and that became leverage for me. It became a strength for me, right? So that plus these overlapping interests, that's sort of the direction that I have chosen to go with my own professional, trajectory. So that would be my suggestion, is seeing if there's overlap between them.
Yeah. I mean, I have to acknowledge as well that it is so refreshing. Just to see you be so authentically yourself. And that's one of the things that stood out to me and why I wanted to talk to you. And I imagine that's why people seek you out and why your clients love working with you, is that sense of authenticity. And this is the thing this is the unique you that you bring to the world that no one else has. For other people who are trying to find that within themselves, how do you work with people? I know some of the work is around finding people's values, but how do you help people get a deeper sense of what that thing is that they bring to the world, or just to be more authentic in general?
Hmm. Well, the age old issue, anytime you ask a psychologist a question, they always preface with, well, it depends. Um, it does. It depends on where they want to go. Okay. And why they feel the need, or more specifically, the hesitation to be authentic. Right. So specifically around authenticity, we can start there first. So I have a friend, and her name, well, her pseudonym is Charlie Bleecker. And Charlie uses a pseudonym because she feels it allows her to more authentically be herself. Okay. Because a lot of people, either they have a job, or they don't want their coworkers to know that I'm going to write about this topic over here, and I don't want my employer to know about it. Not because I'm talking shit, but because it is none of their business, or they may frown upon it or something. Or my friends and family, maybe they're overly critical, and I don't want the people I'm familiar with to know about this website, because I want to be able to fully express myself in a way that I believe I can only do that when I am allowed to put on this mask of this author, this pseudonym, this, whatever. And I mean, Charlie shows her face, like she's very open about it, but she's also like, Charlie isn't my name. And I love Charlie. She's super cool. Uh, uh, but Charlie and I take opposite, like complete opposite paths to the same destination.
Mm,
I exclusively write under my name and my degree, right? Like I am Corey Wilks, PsyD, all over the internet, Twitter, LinkedIn, website, everything. I do that because I believe that allows me to be authentic. Because when I first started writing, I was like, I'm going to write under this company name, and these are the themes I write on, and I quickly realized I felt like I was trying to shoehorn myself. I was trying to force myself to be something or somebody that I wasn't.
mm,
And I was like, okay, I just got to cut through all the bullshit. I'm just going to write under my name. So overall, these are the topics I write about. But at the same time, I'm going to write about whatever the fuck I want to write about because this is me. You came to my website, you followed me. And that allows me to be hyper authentic because I'm
mm.
not trying to be somebody or something. Yes, I'm a psychologist, a coach, whatever else I am, but fundamentally, I'm Corey. I never have to pretend to be anybody else. So that allows me to be authentic. Okay. But Charlie does the opposite for the same reason. You got to find what works for you and what allows you to feel safe enough to be authentic. Okay. Because the other thing with authenticity, the more authentic you are, everybody around you, you're basically giving them permission to embrace their own authenticity. And I found this like, and man, we both went through similar, I'm sure programs and things like a lot of with psychology is like you need to act this way. Like, yeah, you can put your flavor on it, but these are the parameters. You have to relatively speak a certain way, interact a certain way, dress a certain way. And for a long time, I tried to be somebody that I wasn't because I thought, oh, in order to be a professional and in order to be respected, I have to look and dress a certain way. I remember I was talking to a supervisor when I was like a student on practicum, which is like a non-paid mini internship for people who don't know. Um, and I wanted to get a mohawk. And my supervisor, he was like, you can, but you shouldn't because nobody would respect you. And he was like, I used to work with a guy who had a mohawk and he used to have like pink hair and everybody talked shit about him. So if you want to be respected and if you want to go up in the world, don't. And I was like, motherfucker, the guy who helped land the Curiosity rover on Mars has a red mohawk. Who the fuck are you to tell me I can't have a mohawk? Like, you're going to tell me that the engineer who landed this shit on a planet super far away, they're not professional? But that's what a lot of people in professional settings think. But the more I just was myself and not, I'm not, not to be rude, not to be whatever, but just unabashedly myself, the more I realized, well, those certain people are going to shun you, but those are the people you don't want to be accepted by anyway. But more often than not, people come out of the woodwork to be like, hey, man, I really appreciate how authentic you are. Like, that's fucking awesome. And that gave me permission or that inspired me to embrace my own authenticity. So I just wanted to let you know that. And the more I got that, the more I was like, I'm onto something. Right. So I highly recommend thinking about what do you need to feel psychologically safe enough to be authentic.
I love that, Corey. Thank you. You mentioned Memento Mori, and before we started recording, we were having a brief conversation about it. So tell us what this phrase means and why it's so near and dear to you.
So memento mori just translates basically to remember death or remember you will die. And it isn't meant to be like depressing or induce a panic attack or something. It's much more so like, how can you use your mortality as a motivator to live fully? Because, it's this weird thing of like, we fear death, but live like we're immortal, right? Of like, oh, I'll call mom later. I'll visit friends later. I'll do that passion project later, right? Someday I'll do X. The issue is one day you will be out of some days. That's just cold, hard fucking facts. There's no getting around it. So instead of ignoring that and pretending like someday will always be an option, I just say like, look, not just remember I will die, but remember it will end, right? So when a family member calls me, I pick up because I'm like, there's going to be one day where these calls will stop. Or if you have a puppy, not that your puppy's going to die, although clearly the dog will at some point, but it won't be a puppy forever. So how can you enjoy it being a puppy while it is a puppy? How can you practice deep gratitude through memento mori,
Hmm.
right? Or the first time you go on this vacation or you see Niagara Falls, for example, that first time, like you never get another first time, right? Or some breathtaking whatever. You never get that again. So learning to enjoy that while it is there. So it's a really easy way to practice super deep gratitude all the time. Um, but another reason I practice it a lot is a couple years ago, basically after I got fired and I was trying to figure out my life with coaching, I almost died also. It was a rough winter holiday season for me. So long story short, I do Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which is like grappling, like sort of like the martial arts of wrestling, I guess, for people who aren't familiar. Um, and I got what I thought was a hairline fracture on my leg because it was super painful, it was bruised up. And in any kind of combat sport, you tend to get, banged up a lot. So I was like, oh, it's a hairline fracture. I'll just walk it off. It'll be fine. It ended up being a super bad infection that I didn't know about. And by the time I got to the hospital, they're like, yeah, this is super, super bad. If it has gotten into your bloodstream or your bones, you could straight up die. It may be too late.
Goodness.
So they put me on an antibiotic, like an IV drip that I didn't respond to, like it had zero effect. But because it was peak COVID, all the beds were full, so they couldn't transfer me to prep me for surgery. So I waited in a like a hospital, like an ER waiting room for like, I don't know, 12 or 16 hours or something. Um, the home improvement channel, like HGTV was playing and like the TV was broken. So like you couldn't change the channel. So like literally to this day, I have a conditioned response, like basically taste aversion with TV. Like if HGTV comes on, I'm like, like I go right back to being in the fucking ER bed. I hate HGTV because of that. But um, they finally got me transferred, prepped me for surgery. And I remember, and like my girlfriend couldn't be with me because it was like after visitor hours and COVID, there was nobody could hang out with you. And so it was just me with like the occasional nurse checking vitals and this like beeping machine to keep me company. And I remember sitting there thinking, like, I could fucking die. Like, I could die tonight or tomorrow. Like, I may not make it out of this because the test results hadn't come back.
Hmm.
None of us had any idea if it had gotten in my bloodstream and my bones yet. So, and I remember sitting there thinking, if this had been my last week alive, am I satisfied with how I spent my time? And that week I was, because I spent it writing, coaching people, spending time with my loved ones, doing jujitsu. And I was like, I don't want to go out this week. But if I do, I'm satisfied with how I spent my time.
Hmm.
So every week, because clearly I lived, every week since then, I ask myself that same question. Like it's just like you put in like a journal if you journal, right? It's an easy way to do like a weekly review for your journal or just a daily journal prompt or something. Um, because anytime you do that, and you like, if this had been my last week of life, am I satisfied with how I spent my time? Immediately you can pinpoint all the bullshit you let into your life, all the obligations that weren't actually obligatory, all the things you did out of a sense of obligation that were not actually required. Right? Like going to your fucking coworker's 40th birthday at that shit ass bowling alley that everybody hates with lukewarm beer and shitty pizza. You didn't have to go to that, but you did. And you spent what could have been your last week alive at some shitty bowling alley, hitting, hanging out with people you don't care about. Right. So it's like, well, I'm not going to do that again. Right. Of everything that you don't have to do, that you don't enjoy, but you allowed into your life, those are the simplest things to remove moving forward.
Hmm.
So that's why I'm a big proponent of Momento Mori, because it allows you to practice really deep gratitude and to be hyper intentional with how you spend your time.
Mm-hmm. That's a really beautiful practice. And I will be savoring that and reflecting on that. That's wonderful. Um, You've dropped so many nuggets of wisdom, and again, I not only appreciate, what you've shared, the frameworks and philosophies and everything, but also just you. I've just enjoyed talking to you, and I'm sure the listeners do as well. You're embodying what you're teaching and what you're preaching. Is there anything else that kind of you had top of mind that you wanted to share? Other things we haven't covered that you're hoping to share with folks?
No, not that I know of. I'm down to come on again in the future if you have other questions or if people want to submit stuff for like a follow up. I'm down for that.
Amazing. Yeah, I would love it. I would love it. Well, I'll open that opportunity to people, and yeah, we should have a part two of this.
I'm down.
Cool. Thank you, Corey.